All right, it looks like we can go ahead and get started. Hello again. My name is Kira Sobers, and I'm the Media Digitization Manager at the Smithsonian Institution Archives, part of the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, where we collect, preserve, and share the history of the Smithsonian Institution. On behalf of the archives, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program and the 9th installment in the Smithsonian 175th Film Fest, films from the Smithsonian Institution Archives. Before we get started, I want to gratefully acknowledge the Piscataway people on whose ancestral homelands I live, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here. I encourage you to learn more about the historic and current Native communities in the area that you call home through your local museums and centers, as well as the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. And now for a few details about how this will all work. The chat box is where we'll be communicating with you throughout the program and where we'll post links as they come up in the discussion. If you're having technical problems, please send a private chat to either myself, Kira Sobers, or Emily Neckrish, my co-coordinator today, and we will try to help you out. If you have any questions throughout the program, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A box and we will answer them towards the end of the program. For today's presentation, archivist Jennifer Wright is going to talk about the history of the conservation program at the zoo, followed by a film about golden lion tamarin conservation. Then Jennifer will discuss how the materials come to the archives before answering questions from the audience. Jennifer Wright is the Archives and Information Management Team Leader within the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, specializing in records management and archival appraisal and acquisition. With almost 25 years of experience in archives, she has developed the ability to adapt existing processes and procedures to accommodate archival materials in modern formats, such as email, websites, and social media. Wright joined the Smithsonian in 2001, shortly before receiving her MLS in Archives, Records, and Information Management from the University of Maryland. And now I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Kira. And thank you for joining us here today. As the archives began brainstorming about this film festival, today's program was one of the first to be identified. Golden lion tamarins are always a fun and popular topic on our blog and social media, but we've never had a venue for the many long format audio-visual materials we have. In April, soon after Earth Day, seemed the perfect time to share one of the Smithsonian's most well-documented conservation success stories with our audience. Of course, it hadn't occurred to us at the time that this month also marks 50 years of giant pandas at the National Zoo, another of the Smithsonian's most well-documented conservation successes. However, we did get ahead of the curve and featured our pandas during the December installment of the Film Fest, while some of the panda staff still had availability to join us for the discussion. If you missed it, the entire program is available on our YouTube channel. Although we're highlighting the Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Program today, the Smithsonian has been involved in environmental conservation for much of its 175-year history. The first environmental research at the Smithsonian may have been conducted by Secretary Joseph Henry in the 1840s. Henry established a network of approximately 600 people from throughout the Americas to submit monthly weather observations. At the time, meteorology was a fairly new science, but Henry provided the volunteers with instructions, standardized forms, and even instruments. The data was used to study weather patterns and begin predicting major storms. The project ultimately led to the creation of the National Weather Service. Most Smithsonian research stations and field sites have continued to collect weather and environmental data, though. Changes in environmental conditions, especially over time, are often a significant factor in the research being performed or the issue that is attempting to be mitigated. The Smithsonian has also built international networks, such as Forest Geo and Marine Geo, through which information such as environmental data is openly shared. The first intentional act of environmental conservation at the Smithsonian may have been in 1886. Taxidermist William Temple Hornaday traveled to Montana to collect several American bison for mounting and display at the United States National Museum, as the original Smithsonian Museum was known. Although he knew the herds had been seriously depleted by hunting, he was nevertheless shocked to discover that the species was close to extinction. It is this trip that transformed this hunter into the founder of the American conservation movement. Hornaday acquired live bison, which initially lived in a paddock behind the castle. Hornaday's goal, both through the live exhibit and the mounted display in the museum, was to educate the American people about the bison and to generate the interest in saving the species and protecting their habitat. Hornaday didn't stop with the bison, though. He became the founding director of the National Zoo in 1889. Between 1910 and 1912, Smithsonian scientists conducted a biological survey of the Panama Canal Zone to provide a baseline of information about the natural environment prior to the construction of the canal. Not knowing how the alteration to the land would affect the wildlife, their goal was to ensure that the flora and fauna was documented and that specimens were collected for the National Museum. Today, we might call this an environmental impact survey, and it was one of the largest of its time. Construction of the canal required the flooding of the valley. What was once a mountaintop became Barrow, Colorado Island, surrounded by the newly enlarged Lake Gatun. In the 1940s, Smithsonian secretary and ornithologist Alexander Wetmore began making annual research trips to a lab on that island. The lab and the surrounding canal zone biological area had gone through several administrators since its founding and was finally transferred to the Smithsonian in 1946. Beginning in 1957, Director Martin Moynihan began expanding that station's work into other habitats and research disciplines. The Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, as it was renamed in 1966, has worked with the Panamanian government to preserve and protect diverse land and marine habitats throughout the country, where Smithsonian and visiting scientists conduct a variety of research today. The Smithsonian Environmental Research Center followed a similar path of expansion. It was officially established in 1983 upon the merger of the Radiation Biology Laboratory and the Chesapeake Bay Center for Environmental Studies. One of the Radiation Biology Laboratory's signature research programs, the effect of solar radiation on living organisms, had been established by the Smithsonian at the Smithsonian by Secretary Abbott in 1929. The Chesapeake Bay Center for Environmental Studies was created in 1965 after 368 acres of land were bequeathed to the Smithsonian. This tract was along the Road River in Maryland, near the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. With assistance of private foundations, the Smithsonian has acquired approximately 2,400 acres of adjacent land over time, including 14 miles of continuous shoreline. The larger tracts of land offer greater protection to the habitat, as well as the opportunity to conduct ecological research with fewer human influences. The Smithsonian Environmental Research Center has also expanded its influence well beyond the Chesapeake. A major research focus has been invasive marine species and the various means by which they are transported. In 1998, they partnered with the US Coast Guard to establish the National Ballast Information Clearinghouse, with the goal of reducing the number of aquatic nuisance species arriving in the United States on commercial ships. The Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center has taken a different path towards habitat conservation. In the late 1990s, it established the Smithsonian Bird-Friendly Coffee Certification Program. Bird-friendly coffee is grown in a habitat that provides a combination of foliage cover and tree diversity that has been shown to support songbird migration and other biodiversity. The certification program has recently expanded to include cocoa. Conservation has been happening on a smaller scale as well. In 2011, the National Museum of the American Indian was the first Smithsonian building to achieve LEED certification. 3 years later, the new Matthias Lab at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center achieved platinum status, LEED's highest level. Current policies require all new capital projects to achieve LEED Silver certification or higher. Smithsonian facilities, as well as green teams located in many of the museums, continuously work to divert material from landfills, either by identifying recycling partners or by sourcing alternate materials that can be recycled or composted. In some cases, they upcycle, such as turning the large banners hung on the exteriors of the museums into stylish tote bags. There's even a long tradition of what was once referred to as Zoo-Do, but has recently been renamed Project Redo, converting animal waste from the zoo into rich garden soil. Okay, so I've talked a lot about conservation activities at the Smithsonian, and I really haven't skimmed the surface, but you were promised animals. So here we go. In 1972, golden lion tamarins were facing extinction. Following an international conference aimed at saving golden lion tamarin, Deborah Kleiman, a research zoologist and new hire at the National Zoo, tackled the issue of low birth rates in captivity, focusing in particular on their diet. Her research established management protocols that had proven to lead to higher birth rates. Those protocols were then adopted throughout a network of zoos, leading to a boom in healthy golden lion tamarin babies. By the early 1980s, captive reproduction was so successful that the Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Program, as this network administered by the National Zoo was now called, decided to begin reintroducing them to the wild at the Pocos de Santos Biological Reserve in the Atlantic coastal forest of Brazil. It's important to note that although we often talk about Dr. Kleiman in relation to the project, she didn't work in a vacuum. The international zoology community was already raising the alarm and looking for solutions when she began her research. And while she may have done most of the research herself, it took a village to carry out the entire program. In this video, you will also see Associate Director Benjamin Beck, Research Associate and University of Maryland biologist James Dietz, and World Wildlife Fund Senior Program Manager Luann Dietz, all of whom played key roles. Not seen are the dozens of other individuals at the National Zoo, at other zoos and conservation organizations around the world, and in the field in Brazil. But now, I'm going to let them tell you all about it in their own words.
The golden lion tamarin is a small squirrel-sized monkey from the southeastern coastal rainforests of Brazil. Tamarins were once prevalent in this area of Brazil, but deforestation has just wreaked havoc on the habitat. And right now there's only about 2% of the original habitat or less remaining. And with that have gone the tamarins. There may be fewer than 250 now left in the wild.
Together with the loss of habitat, other popularity as pets. They were exported in large numbers from Brazil. The seriousness of the situation became increasingly evident when zoo scientists discovered yet another problem. Tamarins in captivity were having trouble breeding. Even among protected zoo populations, the threat of extinction existed.
From the 40s and 50s, perhaps even earlier, golden lion tamarins were really popular zoo exhibits, but they just never bred at all. And even concerted efforts in the mid-60s, when large numbers of animals were imported into the States, didn't seem to have any impact at all. Animals were breeding erratically, young were dying, adults were dying. In 1972, there were about 70 golden lion tamarins in captivity internationally, and they were surely headed for extinction. All of the projections suggested that they were going downhill.
Scientists were perplexed. What could be done to save the endangered golden lion tamarins?
In 1972, a number of conservation and zoo organizations got together and put on a conference called Saving the Lion Marmoset, whose purpose was to bring together all the information we had about golden lion tamarins and other marmosets and tamarins in order to set up protocols, really, for developing long-term breeding programs. I attended that conference, and that was about when I became involved with this species. And I decided that some basic research really needed to be done on social behavior, growth and development, feeding behavior, and so forth, in order to develop the techniques for breeding them in captivity. And so in Washington, we started a very concerted effort to study the animals and then apply the results of our research to breeding.
Because of the eventual success of these research and breeding programs, the National Zoo sent Dr. James Dietz to Brazil to assess the native habitat in order to better understand how captive-born tamarins might survive in the wild.
The reason that we were sent to Brazil to study the golden lion tamarin is because the few remaining forest fragments are so far apart that the tamarins that live in those fragments, maybe another 200 individuals, are not interbreeding. That means that we have very, very small populations, isolated populations, that are inbreeding at a tremendously rapid rate, just like they would in zoos if they weren't managed. The National Zoo is a logical candidate to deal with these modern-day conservation problems.
What we did here in Washington was to develop the protocols for breeding this species and then successfully breed it. There had already been hints about diet, and a number of different people became involved in the analysis of lion tamarin and other marmoset and tamarin diets, and we realized that the animals had been fed more fruit than they needed and much less protein than they needed. We didn't really know it at the time, although there were hints about it, but it turns out that golden lion tamarins are really active little hunters. They feed a tremendous amount on insects in the wild, using their very long fingers to probe and manipulate in tiny little holes and under bark. And they also go out and hunt small frogs, birds, and feed on birds' eggs. So they're really not only getting insects, but they're getting small vertebrates as well.
In studying golden lion tamarin eating and mating patterns, zoo scientists in the field discovered that they required special monitoring and tracking equipment.
Some of the techniques that we developed were necessary for the first part of our study and included a reliable way to capture golden lion tamarins in order to be able to put a small transmitter around their necks, which allows us to find them in the wild and to study their behavior, and in the case of reintroduced tamarins, if necessary, to provide them with food and shelter. This transmitter produces a small but very audible beep in these headphones and allows us to accurately locate the tamarins anywhere within the reserve where we're working. Sometimes we can find them with a whistle. Like that.
The other finding, though, which turned out to be as significant, was that they are monogamous in the wild. And in captivity, the best method for breeding them is as breeding pairs, essentially, monogamously breeding pairs. Before that, zoos had been keeping them in big groups, and only one female would breed, which is essentially what you get with a monogamously breeding species. And so we started setting them up as pairs, number one. The second thing we discovered was that young needed to gain experience of infants in order to learn how to be better parents. So earlier, many zoos were removing juveniles when new litters were born. What we decided to do was to start leaving those juveniles in the cage and to see what the result of that was. And it turned out that those animals became better parents, and in fact spent a lot of time interacting with their younger siblings. So these two factors, the monogamous pairing and the importance of parental care, learning parental care, were two key factors in our being able to breed these animals successfully. The next step was to send animals to other zoos. And with those animals, we sent our management techniques, and we demanded that they have very specific kinds of enclosures and feeding techniques and so forth. Because what we wanted to do was to have these other zoos mimic our techniques for breeding them because of our success. We also, with that, once they'd been successful, we were essentially setting up the pairs at an international level. When I started out working with the stud book, we did everything by hand. I knew every animal by name, all right? We now have well over 500 golden lion tamarins in captivity in 60 zoos that we're managing. And the management of that population has become very complex. And it's now all computerized. We've got computer software and programs for analyzing pedigrees and for actually making the decisions for us about which animals to mate with which animals and from which zoos. And this was really the first time that, that a species had been bred successfully in captivity, and then this international collaborative program had developed as a result of it. I think this project was pivotal in changing the way in which zoos viewed their role. Zoos had previously been considered, and they even considered themselves as users and consumers and exploiters of animals. Here is a case where, because of collaboration, because of cooperation, the zoos together saved a species that was going extinct, and not only managed to breed it to the point where we had to stop breeding it in captivity, we had too many animals, but actually together put together a package of golden lion tamarins to send back to Brazil. I mean, that's a really significant step that zoos took in one decade, going from being users of animals to actually producing and sending animals back to the wild.
And that's exactly what happened. The National Zoo's Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Program took the next step and developed a long-term plan of action that ultimately would reintroduce the captive-born tamarins back into their native habitat.
And as we thought about a reintroduction, the first question, obviously, is what does a captive-born monkey need to know to survive in the wild? The first thing we hit upon was food. How would a captive-born monkey, who all of its life has learned all he has to do is sit and wait for a keeper to come with a pan of finely cut up fruits and vegetables and nice cooperative little crickets, how would that animal learn that in the wild, food is distributed all over the place, and it doesn't come cut up. It comes in big pieces, and it comes inside tough rinds. And the crickets aren't chilled to keep them from running away, quite the contrary. Some of the insects are capable of camouflage, rapid escape, and even very painful self-defense. Well, we thought immediately that what our animals had to do was to develop, what our captive animals had to do was learn to develop an attitude that they had to work for their food. They had to go out and search for food that was distributed throughout a forest, that was unpredictable or almost unpredictable in the times it would be available, the places it would be available. It came in big packages that were covered up with tough rinds. You couldn't see the edible portion. They had to become searchers rather than waiters. And so we began in their cages here at the National Zoo, later at the Rio de Janeiro Primate Center in Brazil, and even later at large halfway houses, cages built in the forest. We began to present them with foods that were hidden, that were distributed in time and place, that would appear mysteriously, that were wrapped up in little packages, that were embedded so they couldn't see the edible parts. And slowly, the animals began to change their strategy from waiting to searching. And this effect was most dramatic in youngsters. When we released the animals, they clearly were unable to find enough food to survive. And at that time, our feeling was that the only way we could get these animals to graduate, to move out into the forest, was to keep them a little bit hungry. And then we discovered another complication, and that is that they were not very good at locomoting. Locomotion was something that we had virtually forgotten about in preparation. A monkey knows how to move around, right? Not true. They didn't know how to get back. The animals seemed to have never developed a sense of how to orient through a novel three-dimensional environment and remember where they are in relationship to where they were. They weren't able to form cognitive maps. And these were deficits that we simply had not anticipated, and as a result, our preparation did not include. Another thing that we tried to include in our preparation was teaching the animals something about predators and dangerous foods. We presented them with a large toad. They tried to eat it, even though several of them almost died as a result of biting the toad on the parotid sacs and getting really very, very ill. We barely saved 2 tamarins in that little experiment. The next day we presented the toad again, this time in a nice little enclosure so they couldn't bite it. And the whole group, not only the animals that were affected, but all the rest of the animals who watched were quite eager to get to the toad again. They seemed to have learned absolutely nothing by the experience. Snakes, they attacked. They tried to eat snakes. You see, we are methodologically handicapped because we can't do real experiments. We're not going to risk a tamarin by throwing in a hot snake, and there's no sense defanging the snake because then the tamarins learn that snakes aren't harmful. We've really had an evolving strategy of how to reintroduce tamarins, and indeed, we have had mortality in previous years. We are learning how to do this.
The learning process back in Brazil went through many stages. Dr. James Dietz remembers back to the first Golden Lion Tamarin release in Brazil in 1984.
On May 31st of 1984, we opened the doors to those large cages, and the scientists sat below and watched as the tamarins came out and, for the first time ever, walked on natural vegetation outside of a cage. It was an emotional moment for all of us. The tamarins took it in stride.
For the second reintroduction attempt, we continued to perfect our food preparation technique and turned their cage into a wonderful little Easter egg hunt every day by hiding food all over the place and making them learn to search. And then additionally, we addressed the locomotion problem. And we did this by getting rid of all this stout milled wood furniture and supplying flexible, natural vegetation, largely vines. And furthermore, in order to test the efficacy of preparation, we thought our little school was a good idea, but to really test it, we trained one group and we left another group totally untrained and released them cold turkey. And what we found as a result was that the untrained group did not do as well as the trained group, but the differences were not substantial, and the training was not sufficient to make sure that animals survived after they were reintroduced. It was helpful, but not sufficient. Well, we couldn't let this poor untrained group simply perish in the forest, so we began a program of training after they were released. And we found that even though the animals were untrained, they stayed around, they didn't run away, and that we could do quite effective training after the animals were actually reintroduced to the wild. And it began to dawn on us that our training program was rather like learning to fly in a flight simulator. It helps, but it isn't the real thing. Post-release training, on the other hand, was more like learning to fly in a real airplane. You got up there and you did it, and you learned to fly under absolutely natural conditions. Well, when I suggested to my colleagues that we should change our whole reintroduction strategy, and that we should really train animals after release, where we could do it totally realistically, we'd save a lot of money because we didn't have to build all these cages in the forest, they were quite skeptical. Understandably, those of us who had zoo backgrounds are always skeptical about letting animals loose without being able to give them some advantage. So in order to experiment with this technique in a way that was conservative, we decided to do it on the grounds of the National Zoo in Washington. And in 1986, we turned loose a group of golden lion tamarins on the zoo grounds. And what we found was that that group of tamarins, after a little initial confusion, would stay around, given that they had a nest box and they had a food source. And we kept their little bellies full. No training whatsoever yet. We gave them a full supply of food. They had their nest box and their family. And gradually, quite on their own, they began to explore. And as they explored their environment, they were searching for natural foods, and they were also learning how to locomote. And they were also learning how to get back. So they were, in essence, training themselves simply because we established an environment in which it was possible for them to make some mistakes safely. If they got lost, we brought them back. That resulted in not only one of the most innovative and inexpensive zoo exhibits in the history of North American zoos. It is an absolutely wonderful zoo exhibit, and our public really enjoys it. But it's more than just an exhibit. It is a living laboratory in which we studied a brand new technique for reintroduction of golden lion tamarins, what we call the post-release training technique, or the cold release training. Preparation takes place not in a flight simulator before release, but in the airplane after they're released. And the animals on the NZP grounds wandered quite some distance, several hundred meters. They had regular territorial encounters with a group of golden lion tamarins held elsewhere in the zoo. They invaded a gibbon cage, they invaded a hawk eagle cage. They were really quite active, terrorized the whole zoo, kept us jumping. But more important, we learned something very important, that we could train animals, or the animals would train themselves after release. And that we incorporated into the 1987 Reintroduction Program. We reintroduced in the second week of September 21 golden lion tamarins in Brazil, and used the post-release training technique. And we have had absolutely no mortality now, some 6 weeks later.
This animal is calling in the other members of the group. You can see some of them coming in across ropes. They're coming into their nest box as it's getting late in the day. Our northern forests don't have the same amount of vines that we have in tropical forests, so we had to provide ropes for our tamarins here.
Of course, none of the work done by the National Zoo scientists would have borne fruit without the help of many concerned people in Brazil. While the zoos worked for a decade on saving the tamarins, Brazilians became actively involved in saving the habitat itself.
One of the first individuals to really be concerned and understand what was happening to golden lion tamarins was a man named Adalmar Coimbra Filho, a Brazilian. And in the mid-60s, he was already trying to begin breeding them, and that eventually led to his developing and becoming the first director of the Rio de Janeiro Primate Center, which is now the only primate center in the world that is devoted solely to the breeding of the endangered species of a particular region, in this instance, Brazil. So Dr. Coimbra has developed a highly unique primate center, whose purpose is only to breed endangered species, and the golden lion tamarin was one of the first species he concentrated on. He was also instrumental in developing the plans and choosing the site for what is now the only reserve for the golden lion tamarin in the world, which is the Poço de Santos Reserve, northeast of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
But the story of saving the habitat for the golden lion tamarin involved more than the efforts of one man. It was, in fact, an extensive grassroots educational process developed in conjunction with the National Zoo and guided by education specialist Luann Dietz.
What we discovered was that people really knew very, very little about the tamarin, and if they did know that it existed in their area, they really didn't realize that it was disappearing, or that if they did realize it was disappearing, that its disappearance was connected with the lack of forest or the disappearing of forest. The forest area that we're trying to conserve for the tamarins and these other species is the Brazilian Atlantic coastal forest. It's a very different ecosystem from the Amazon. It's completely separate. It's located between the coastal mountain range and the sea. The golden lion tamarins live in an area, essentially the state of Rio, along this coastal area. But it's the most populated area of Brazil, and only about 2% of that forest still exists. We are trying to make the tamarin a symbol for conservation in Brazil, and this logo was actually developed with our ideas by artists here at the National Zoo and was accepted to be the symbol for the reserve. We put in Brazil, it says Reserva Biológica Poço das Santas, the Brazilian name for this reserve. We put it on t-shirts, on all our educational materials, on the cars, and it really is becoming a recognizable symbol. Even though it doesn't say anything about tamarins, people recognize it as a symbol for conservation of tamarins and of the forest. The reserve itself is not large enough to guarantee the survival of the species. We needed to work on private land as well. This television enabled us to reach people all over Brazil. And when we finally were able to contact landowners, school kids as well, they already recognized the tamarin as sort of a TV star. We made a real effort in the TV message to call attention to the names of the local regions and deal a little bit with local pride, which is real important in a rural setting. And with that big door open, we were able, with our team making personal visits, to convince local landowners to begin to register their land as private permanent reserves. They can get a tax deduction on their property tax, but what they're mostly interested in is having tamarins. They saw them on TV and they want to have them in their forest. And they can have them because they live in the region.
The Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Project looks forward to future reintroductions of captive-bred tamarins into native habitats. If the reintroductions are successful, the whole project may be an appropriate model for the preservation of other endangered species.
And this was really the first time that, that a species had been bred successfully in captivity, and then this international collaborative program had developed as a result of it.
Okay, welcome back. It's a little bit of an abrupt ending to that film. So I hope you learned a lot about the program there, and to let you hear about it in their own words. They are able to explain it much better than I ever could. So at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that Earth Day was last week and that the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the pandas was this month. But April also happens to be Records and Information Management Month. And I thought I would use this opportunity to discuss how we document conservation programs at the zoo. My team serves as a bridge between offices throughout the Smithsonian and the archives. We provide guidance to staff in managing the records they're still actively using, determine which of those records should be transferred to the archives once they are no longer needed in the office, and then properly house, describe, and accession them in the archival collections. As the primary archives liaison to the National Zoo, I personally transferred and processed 51 cubic feet of archival records related to the Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Program. So what is in all these boxes? Well, there are as many reasons as there are future researchers for wanting to know more about a conservation program. Some will be interested in the science, some will be interested in the history. Others will have a more specialized interest: environmental activists, educators, policy advisors, lawyers, writers, local landowners, future conservation programs. The list is endless. Our goal is to collect, maintain, and preserve the files that best document as many aspects of the program as we can, while weeding out drafts, duplicates, and routine and logistical files. In the case of the Golden Lion Tameron Conservation Program, there were three main aspects of the program that we attempted to document. First, there was the research. This included the initial research that led to the protocols, the experimentation that went into improving the success of each reintroduction, and the longer-term monitoring of the Golden Lion tamarins and their offspring in the wild. Archival records included data sheets, statistics, handwritten observations, field books, reports, presentations, and audiovisual recordings taken as part as behavioral observations. Second, there was the administration of the program. The Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Program worked across organizations and across borders to manage everything from protocols to genetic diversity, to establish partnerships, and of course, to handle mundane topics such as funding and permits. Archival records included correspondence, memoranda, reports, policies, procedures, meeting materials, permits, photos, and maps. Third, there was the education and outreach that was primarily occurring in Brazil to encourage the protection of the Golden Lion tamarins and their habitat. This included traditional public affairs work, marketing campaigns, teacher training, and also children's activities. Archival records included publications, reports, press releases, brochures, videos, course materials, correspondence, clippings, planning documents, proposals, agreements, and even a script for a play called The Tamarin Trickster. The primary activities of the Golden Lion Tamarin Conservation Program were transferred to a Brazilian non-governmental organization, Associação Maico Leal Dourado, and I apologize for my pronunciation, in 1992. The National Zoo continued its involvement, but that is where the bulk of the program records end. Although computers were being used and Deborah Kleiman was beginning to save files to floppy disks in the early 1990s, this program mostly predates the modern digital age. Additional archival record types that we might see if the program still existed today would be databases and spreadsheets, email, websites, and social media. But of course, the program does still exist today. It continues on in Brazil, and researchers at the National Zoo and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute use the knowledge gained from this program and others to continue to save other species and their habitats. In fact, just this week, they announced the birth of a golden lion-headed tamarin, a close relative of the golden lion tamarin, the second such birth at the zoo in 6 months. And here at the archives, we'll ensure that the records are available for generations to come. And so we're ending the formal presentation here. We covered a whole lot of ground today. And so now we're going to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was fascinating. I'm a Deborah Kleiman fan, so this is all my favorite thing. We have a couple of questions that have come in so far. One of them is, sorry, I'm trying to read through the question. Okay, so one of the questions was what was the original purpose of the film and what was the original audience for it, which is something that you and I have talked about a little bit already, but I don't know if you want to answer that one.
Yeah, we were actually just talking about this before this presentation. When we received these audiovisual materials, we received a whole, I think of 5 or 6 boxes where it was just audiovisual materials. There was no accompanying documentation to explain what they were. They had sort of been separated from whatever might have told us what they were. And on the tapes themselves, there wasn't really much information about what they were used for. We believe, based on the content, that it was probably some sort of promotional video about the program and trying to generate interest in the program, but we can't be 100% sure.
And there was a follow-on question to that about what year the film was made. I don't know that we have the exact date for that, and Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to say late 80s.
I think somewhere around there.
Okay, another question that came in is, what did the Golden Lion Tamarin records first look like when they arrived at the archives? You mentioned a little bit about the video, but what about the rest of the records?
So they arrived, they did not arrive all at once. They arrived from numerous different people, and they were maintained by different people, and some people are more organized than others. Deborah Kleiman was probably the least organized of the group, but not too bad. She was a little messy with her files, but I could usually tell what they were, what things were, and she generally put things in folders, and just needed a little help with, or I just needed to help out with putting some additional details about the contents of what was in those folders. Most of the time, I could tell what I was looking at, and they did need some reorganization. Sometimes there would be a folder about golden lion tamarins sitting next to a folder about pandas. That is actually fairly typical of scientists, and actually we see much worse. The files we received from Luann Dietz and from Jim Dietz were actually very well organized. Jim Dietz in particular, what we received from him were observation sheets. He organized locals to observe the golden lion tamarins in the wild, and taught them how to make certain types of observations, fill out the sheets, and they were all arranged. I guess there were letter codes assigned to the various groups, and then the offspring of those groups might have had additional letter codes, and they were all very well organized by the groups and the offspring groups. And so for those, they were in great shape. All we needed to do was put them in some new folders. Anything that, any records or that are maintained in the field for any length of time are always a little beat up when they make it to us, just because of the conditions that they're stored in.
Luann is actually in the audience with us
Yes.
here.
Hello, Luann.
So Jennifer, to sort of a follow on to that, somebody asked, you mentioned the amount of golden lion tamarin records we have at the archives. Is that amount pretty unusual for one initiative? Pretty common?
It is. I would say that most conservation programs, we do not receive nearly that much material. That said, this was probably a longer term program than a lot of programs. A lot of them, are 5 years, 10 years, maybe. The bulk of the main part of this program was about 20 years. And then, the zoo was still involved for a while after that. So there was a fair amount of material. And I think one of the differences is that a lot of conservation programs, it is not one institution involved. There are multiple institutions involved. And oftentimes the records wind up getting split up, with the Smithsonian staff having some of the records, and the staff of another organization having some of the records. And the records don't always come together to one place. They wound up split between different places. And that was not the case for this program.
There are a couple of questions that have come in the Q&A that I'm going to address directly about the current breeding practices at the National Zoo for the golden lion tamarins. And I would just say that we are Jennifer is experts on the records, but we're not experts on what is currently happening at the zoo. So I would encourage you to direct those questions to the National Zoo and their staff there, because they will know more specifically. There were questions about the breeding pair that's there, and if the pairs have ever decided that they don't like each other and don't want to mate with each other, as well as whether or not this kind of research is currently happening at the zoo on the mall, or not in the mall in DC, or if it's only happening out at a CBI. And so again, I would just reiterate that our colleagues at the National Zoo can answer those questions for you. But we do have another records related question. Were you able to work with a conservation biologist to accession the records for this program, or do they arrive after? And sort of what is the time frame from when programs end versus when the archives actually gets a hold of this stuff?
In most cases, it varies. For a longer term program, we sometimes get some of the records while the program is ongoing. In this case, we got all of the records afterwards, but some of the records, Deborah Kleiman did organize herself, and I actually met her at the loading dock. She was already retired, but she was helping clean out files in the building, and I met her at the loading dock and picked them up. The same thing is with the Dietzes. Luann and Jim, they both prepared their files for me, and I met met them at the loading dock as well, and picked up their files. But then yeah, I also received after Deborah's death, I did one of the staff at the zoo did go through her files and pack them up for me. I don't believe he had been associated with the program. I think he was newer. So I don't know if he had actually gone through the files or just put them in boxes. And then she also had files at her home that I had gone and met with her widower and gone through all of her filing cabinets. And so that was done, completely on my own. And her widower did have some sense of what things were, but was not knowledgeable about all of the details.
Thank you. Also, for those of you who had questions specifically about the practices at the zoo right now, Adrienne Stelmach has graciously offered their email address in the chat for anyone who wants to email them directly with their questions. But I think that's time. I think that's all the time we have for questions now. So thank you, Jennifer, so much for talking about this, for talking about the conservation history at the Smithsonian and how that sort of fits in with the work that we do here at the archives. And thank you to everyone who joined us and tuned in today. And we will see you next month.